He walked into that boardroom with a pressed shirt he'd ironed 3 times and a resume that had taken him 6 months to feel proud of. He was already nervous, already second-guessing every word he'd rehearsed in the car. Then the door opened, and the woman sitting at the head of the table looked up. The same eyes, the same quiet intelligence behind them. The girl from the back row of Westfield High, the one nobody paid attention to, was now the CEO of the fastest-growing tech company in the city, and she had known all along. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and follow all the way to the end. Let's see how far this one travels. The alarm went off at 5:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before it was supposed to, because Lily had snuck into Ethan's room sometime in the night and knocked his phone off the nightstand. He didn't hear it hit the floor. He heard it buzzing against the hardwood at 5:47, face down, muffled. And he lay there for a second, staring at the ceiling, already knowing he wasn't going back to sleep. He reached down, picked it up, checked the time. Then he remembered what day it was, and his stomach dropped. Interview day. He sat up slowly. Lily was curled against his left side, one arm thrown over his stomach, her hair a complete disaster across the pillow. She was breathing the slow, easy way kids do when they're completely out. No worries, no weight, just sleep. He watched her for a moment. 7 years old, and she still climbed into his bed during thunderstorms, or when she had bad dreams, or sometimes just because she felt like it. He'd stopped questioning it a long time ago. He eased himself out from under her arm without waking her, pulled the blanket up over her shoulder, and stood in the dark for a second with his hands on his hips. He needed this job. That wasn't just something he told himself to feel motivated. It was a specific, practical, concrete need, the kind that had numbers attached to it. His lease was going up in 2 months. Lily's school fees for the fall were due in 6 weeks. His car needed new tires before winter, and the quote he'd gotten at the shop 3 weeks ago had made him stand very still in the parking lot for about 30 seconds, just processing. The position at Nixlara Technologies was a management role. Operations manager, mid-level, overseeing a team of 12 in their logistics and fulfillment division. It wasn't glamorous. He didn't need glamorous. The salary was nearly double what he was making at the warehouse. The benefits package included dental, and there was a clear structure for advancement if you produced results. He'd read the job description enough times that he could probably recite it in his sleep. He'd also done 3 rounds of applications before this one and hadn't made it past the first interview. Once because the company went with an internal candidate. Once because he honestly couldn't tell. The third time, the recruiter had sent him a very polite rejection email with the phrase overqualified for the current scope in the second paragraph, which he'd read twice and then put his phone down and not looked at it for an hour. This one felt different. He wasn't sure why. Maybe that was just what he needed to tell himself to keep going. He showered, shaved carefully, and put on the charcoal gray pants and the white button-down he'd had dry cleaned 2 days ago. The jacket was hanging on the back of his closet door in a dry cleaning bag. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for longer than he needed to. He looked okay, a little tired around the eyes. That was chronic, that had been chronic for years, but okay. Mrs. Calloway from the second floor came up at 7:30 to watch Lily. She was 64, recently retired, and she'd been helping him out with childcare for almost 2 years now. He paid her, though she'd told him 3 separate times she didn't need the money, and he'd told her 3 separate times that he wasn't comfortable with any other arrangement. They'd settled into a routine. "You look sharp," she said at the door, giving him a once-over. "I look like I ironed this shirt too many times." "That's what sharp looks like." She stepped inside. "Go. You're going to be late if you stand there arguing with me." Lily appeared at the end of the hallway in her pajamas, hair still sideways from sleep. "Where are you going?" "Interview, remember? I told you last night." She blinked at him. "You look different." Different good or different bad? She considered this with the serious deliberation that only 7-year-olds apply to minor questions. "Different like a teacher," she finally said, "but the kind that knows stuff." He wasn't sure whether that was a compliment, but he chose to take it as one. He crossed the hall, crouched down, and kissed the top of her chaotic hair. "Be good." "I'm always good." "That's not true." She grinned. I'm usually good. Better. He stood up, grabbed his bag, and headed for the stairs. Quote, the next Lara Technologies building was a glass and concrete tower in the newer part of the downtown business district, the kind of building that had a revolving door and a lobby with very high ceilings, and people who walked through it like they had somewhere to be. He'd driven past it before without giving it much thought. Standing in front of it now, looking up, he felt the specific low-grade anxiety of being somewhere that wasn't built for people like him. He pushed through the revolving door anyway. The lobby had a reception desk staffed by a young woman with a headset who directed him up to the 14th floor. The elevator was fast and nearly silent. He straightened his jacket in the reflection of the doors. The reception area on 14 was cleaner and quieter than the lobby. A man about his age in a blue blazer checked his name against a list and asked him to wait. There were two other candidates in the waiting area, a woman in her mid-30s with a leather portfolio on her lap, and a man a few years older than Ethan in a suit that clearly cost more than Ethan's entire wardrobe. Both of them had the polished, practiced look of people who had been doing this for a long time. Ethan sat down. He put his bag between his feet. He looked at the view of the city through the windows and thought about Lily saying he looked like a teacher who knew stuff. He'd take it. He was called in 40 minutes later. The conference room was large, not intimidatingly large, but large enough that the rectangular table with its 10 chairs and the panel of 4 people waiting on the far side of it felt like an intentional statement about proportion. There was a water pitcher and glasses on the table, floor-to-ceiling windows behind the panel. The city stretched out behind them, flat and gray and enormous under an overcast sky. He introduced himself to each of them in turn. There was a man named Gerald Holt, the director of operations, 50s, with the compressed energy of someone who'd been solving problems his whole career and had very little patience for people who didn't. There was a woman named Sharon Lynn, HR director, mid-40s, formal but not unfriendly. A younger man named Priya something, he missed the last name, who was apparently head of team integration. And then, at the center of the group, the one who hadn't stood to shake his hand because she was still looking at something on the folder in front of her. She looked up. Ethan felt the recognition hit him like stepping off a curb he hadn't seen. Dark hair, cut shorter than he remembered. Brown eyes with that specific quality of attention. Like she was actually watching you, not just looking at you. The quiet that had always been around her, except now it wasn't shyness. It was something else entirely. Something that had been built over years and had the density of something real. Victoria Hayes. He said nothing. For about 2 full seconds, he said absolutely nothing, which was 2 seconds longer than he could afford in a job interview. She held his gaze for just a moment, just long enough that he knew she recognized him, knew she had to, could see it in the fraction of a second before she settled into something more neutral. And then she opened the folder in front of her and said, Mr. Walker, thank you for coming in. Please, have a seat. Her voice was the same, lower now, steadier, with the kind of measured quality that comes from years of running rooms like this one, but the same. He sat down. He had a lot of questions. He asked none of them. Quote. The interview lasted an hour and 12 minutes. He knew because he checked his watch when it ended, and then looked back at the time he'd walked in, and the math came out to an hour and 12 minutes. Gerald Holt asked him about supply chain bottlenecks and how he'd handled workflow disruptions at the warehouse level. He gave specific answers with specific numbers. The quarter where he'd restructured the overnight receiving process and cut processing time by 22%. The staff conflict he'd mediated that had been dragging team output down for 3 months before anyone with a title had noticed it. He didn't dress anything up. He said what happened and what he did about it. Sharon Lynn asked him about managing people, specifically about managing people who'd been in their roles longer than he'd held his, and how he handled resistance. He thought about that one before he answered. He said he'd learned early that experience and expertise weren't the same thing, and that the most effective thing he'd found was to ask questions before drawing conclusions. People who felt heard were more likely to cooperate than people who felt managed. Priya asked about his experience with software platforms, and he gave an honest account. He knew the basics, he'd used a few different systems, he was not a specialist, but he was a fast learner when the stakes were clear. and he gave the example of teaching himself the scheduling software at his current job when it was replaced, and nobody bothered to run proper training. He answered every question. He didn't oversell. He didn't undersell. He sat straight and kept his hands still and tried not to think about the woman sitting at the center of the table who had spent 3 hours with him in a cafe 4 days ago without once mentioning any of this. Victoria asked 2 questions. The first was about his long-term career goals, and she asked it the way she asked everything else. Simply, directly, without preamble. He told her the truth. He wanted a stable path that let him provide for his daughter without burning himself out. He wanted to do work that was actually meaningful. He was not interested in a position he would outgrow in 8 months, and he was not interested in a position that was only there to fill a box on someone's chart. She made a note. The second question she asked came at the end, after Gerald and Sharon had mostly wrapped up their sections. She looked at him for a moment before she asked it, and he had the sensation that the question was not for the benefit of the panel. What made you apply for this role specifically? He could have given the practiced answer, the company's growth trajectory, the position's scope, all true things he'd already prepared. He looked at her for a second. Something shifted in him. Because I've been making decisions for other people for long enough that I know how to make them work, he said. Not just for myself. I'm used to having more at stake than just my own outcome. That's not a liability. I think that's actually the thing I'd bring to this job that most candidates can't. Nobody said anything for a moment. Gerald Holt wrote something down. Victoria's expression didn't change, but she looked at him for just a breath longer than necessary before she said, "Thank you, Mr. Walker. We'll be in touch." Annette. He didn't know what to do with any of it. He rode the elevator down and walked through the lobby and pushed through the revolving door into the gray October air and stood on the sidewalk for a minute, just standing there, before he started moving toward the parking garage. She had known. At the cafe, she had known exactly who he was. She'd seen him, recognized him, and she'd sat there for 3 hours talking about high school and bad cafeteria food, and the time they'd both been stuck in the same school bus that broke down on the highway in 10th grade. And she had not said one word about who she was now. He tried to figure out how he felt about that, and found he couldn't get a clean answer. The cafe was called Cedar and Cup, and it was the kind of place that had been on that corner for 15 years and looked exactly like it. Small, warm, slightly crowded in the afternoon, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu above the counter. He'd stopped in for the first time that Tuesday because he was tired and the coffee at the warehouse break room had been undrinkable since the machine started making a grinding noise in September. He'd been sitting at the counter with his coffee and a sandwich he didn't really need when someone sat down 2 stools away and said, "Is the coffee actually good here, or did you just need somewhere to sit?" He'd looked over. She'd been watching him with a half smile, such not flirtatious, just amused, like she'd asked the question to see what he'd say. "Honestly?" he'd said. "Both." She'd laughed, a real one. Something about her face had pulled at him in the way that vaguely familiar things do, a half-recognition he couldn't quite place, like a song he knew the melody to but couldn't name. "Do I know you?" he'd said. She'd looked at him for a second. "Maybe. I went to Westfield High." It hit him then. Victoria, Hayes, Ethan Walker. She'd sounded like she was enjoying this. "You finally recognize me." He'd stared at her. "You look different." Everyone looks different 15 years later, hopefully. He'd meant it as a compliment and thought she understood that, though he was aware he hadn't said it well. She had looked different, not in the way of being unrecognizable, but in the way of being fully herself in a way that the version of her he remembered had been working toward without quite arriving. In high school, she'd been quiet in the specific way of someone who had a lot of thoughts she didn't trust people to receive. Now the quiet was just a quality she had, not a protection. They'd stayed for almost 3 hours. He'd bought her a second coffee, and she'd bought him a third without asking, and he'd pretended to object for about 4 seconds. They'd talked about people they both remembered and places that had changed and small things. What they'd both tried to do after graduation, where they'd ended up, the small, sharp turns that life makes when you're not planning for them. He told her about Lily, straightforwardly, the way he always did, because he'd learned early that how he introduced that part of his life sorted people out pretty quickly. Victoria had asked questions, not the polite, obligatory kind, Actual questions. What was she like? What did she like to do? He'd shown her a photo on his phone, and Victoria had smiled at it like she was seeing something she found genuinely good. She told him she worked in tech, something about running a company, vague enough that he hadn't pressed. He'd been talking too much about himself, and by the time he registered that he didn't have a clear picture of what she did, it felt late to circle back without making it awkward. He'd told himself he'd ask more next time. He hadn't thought much about the fact that there might not be a next time, or at least not a casual one. He was thinking about it now, standing on the sidewalk outside the Nextlara building in his interview jacket, remembering the way she'd said goodbye at the cafe door with a warmth that had felt genuine and uncomplicated. Nothing about it had been uncomplicated. She'd just been the only one who knew that. He got his car from the garage and drove home. He changed out of the interview clothes, hung the jacket back up, and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, doing the thing he always did after interviews, running back through the whole thing, question by question, looking for where he'd gone wrong or where he'd done better than he expected. He'd done well. He was honest enough with himself to see that. The panel had been engaged. Gerald Holt's body language had shifted somewhere around the third question from the baseline skepticism of a man who'd seen a lot of candidates to something that looked more like active interest. He didn't know what that meant in terms of outcomes, but he knew the difference between a room that was tolerating him and a room that was listening. Whether any of it mattered depended on things outside his control. It always did. He was still sitting there when Mrs. Calloway brought Lily back up at 4 o'clock. "How'd it go?" Mrs. Calloway asked. "I don't know yet." She nodded like that was an acceptable answer. She knew enough not to push. Lily climbed up onto the chair across from him and looked at him across the table. "Did they like you?" "I think so. I don't know." "Did you answer the questions?" "Yes." "Did you say all the words right?" "Mostly." She considered this. "Then I think you did good." She said it with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who had not yet learned to qualify everything. He looked at her for a second, the bright certainty of her, and thought about what he'd said in that room, more at stake than just my own outcome, and knew he'd meant it. "Thanks, kid," he said. "You're welcome," she said, and then, "Can we have pasta tonight?" He didn't call anyone. He didn't have anyone to call in that way. The people he was closest to were the people in his apartment, one of whom was 7 and one of whom went home at 5. His sister was in Portland and they talked every couple of weeks, close enough that he could call her, but not so close that he called her for things like this. He had a few friends from the warehouse, good people, but not the kind of relationship where he dissected job interviews over the phone at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday. He made pasta. He ate with Lily. He helped her with her math homework, which involved some gentle negotiation about what showing your work meant and why it was required. He read to her for 20 minutes after her bath. He sat at the edge of her bed after the light was out and listened to her talk about something that had happened at school until her sentences started getting looser and more disconnected, the way they always did just before she dropped off. He waited until her breathing evened out. Then he went and sat in the living room in the quiet and thought about Victoria Hayes sitting at the head of that boardroom table, looking at him with that absolutely composed expression and saying, "Thank you for coming in. Please have a seat," like they'd never had 3 hours of coffee and shared history and the particular comfort of being recognized. She'd had her reasons. He was almost sure of that. He just didn't know what they were. He wasn't angry. He didn't know exactly what he was. He picked up his phone and looked at it and then put it back down. There was nothing to do right now except wait. He was good at waiting. He'd had years of practice. The call came 6 days later. He was in the break room at the warehouse when his phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number with a city area code. He stepped out into the corridor to answer it. "Mr. Walker, this is Sharon Lynn from Nextlara Technologies. Do you have a moment?" He stood very still. "Yes. We'd like to invite you back for a second-round interview. There are a few additional stakeholders who'd like to meet with you, and we'd also like to discuss the specific project scope of the role in more detail. Would Thursday work for you?" He said Thursday would work. He stood in the corridor for a moment after he hung up. Someone from the loading dock walked past him and said something he didn't catch, and he nodded in response to whatever it was. Then he went back into the break room, poured himself a coffee he didn't need, and stood by the window watching a truck pull out of the yard, and let himself feel, carefully, without letting it get too large, the particular lightness of a door that might be opening. He still had questions about Victoria, about what any of it meant, but they were questions he could ask later. Right now there was Thursday. Thursday came fast. Ethan was back on the 14th floor by 9:15, and this time the waiting area had 3 other people in it. 2 he hadn't seen before, and 1 who'd been there on Tuesday, the woman with the leather portfolio. She gave him a brief nod of recognition that meant nothing beyond, "I see you were also called back," and he nodded in return and sat down on the opposite end of the row. The second interview was different in structure, less formal, more dispersed. They took him through 2 separate sessions, one with the integration team, a group of 5 people who asked highly specific questions about workflow sequencing and team conflict, and one scenario question about what he would do if he inherited a team with 2 high performers who genuinely couldn't stand each other. He answered that one from experience rather than theory, because he'd lived that exact situation for 4 months at the warehouse, and still had opinions about it. The second session was with Gerald Holt alone, in a smaller room off the main corridor. Gerald was the kind of man who didn't waste language. He asked Ethan to walk him through 3 specific decisions he'd made in the last 2 years that he stood behind, and then asked him to walk through 1 decision he'd made that he'd do differently. Ethan gave him all 4 without hesitation. The last one, a staffing call he'd made that had seemed efficient at the time and had quietly damaged morale for 6 weeks afterward, he described plainly, without excuse-making. Gerald listened with his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted and said almost nothing. At the end, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You're not what I expected when I pulled your file." Ethan wasn't sure how to take that. "Is that a good thing?" "Mostly." Gerald stood up and extended his hand. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Walker." Victoria was not in either session. He didn't see her at all. He left the building telling himself that was probably the normal and appropriate thing, that the CEO didn't sit in on second-round interviews for mid-level management positions, and that he was reading significance into an absence that had none. He almost believed himself. The offer came 8 days later. He was home when Sharon Lynn called. A Friday evening, Lily in the other room watching something with too much background music. He walked into the kitchen and closed the door and stood at the counter listening while Sharon outlined the terms. The title. The salary. She said the number, and he kept his voice completely neutral while something in his chest shifted. The benefits. The start date, pending background check. She asked if he had any questions. He had several questions, and none of them were about the job. He said the terms sounded right, that he'd like to review the formal offer letter before signing, and that he'd be in touch by Monday. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he opened the door to the living room and said, "Lily." She looked up from the television. "We got it." She stared at him for a second, processing. Then she came off the couch and ran at him with the full-body commitment of a 7-year-old receiving good news, and he caught her and lifted her, and she squeezed his neck hard enough to be mildly uncomfortable, which was exactly right. He signed the offer letter Monday morning. His first week at Nextlara was the kind of week that required all of his concentration just to get through without looking incompetent. There was a systems orientation and an HR intake process and a series of introductory meetings that ran long and told him less than he needed to know. His team of 12 was assembled on Wednesday morning in a conference room for what the calendar invitation had described as a team integration session, which turned out to mean everyone sitting around a table trying to figure out each other's intentions. There were people who'd worked there for years and clearly had views about the previous manager, who had apparently left on terms that nobody seemed eager to explain directly. There was a woman named Dara who was the most competent person on the floor and clearly knew it and was watching him with an evaluation that made him feel like a new appliance that hadn't been tested yet. There was a man named Curtis who asked 3 questions in the first meeting that were technically about workflow and actually about whether Ethan was going to rearrange things for no reason. He answered Curtis's questions at face value because the only way to diffuse that dynamic was to be straightforwardly useful. He was not trying to rearrange things for no reason. He was trying to understand what was already there before he touched anything. That was a principle he'd developed out of necessity, having come into situations before where people who should have briefed him hadn't, and the gaps were always expensive. He came in early. He stayed moderately late. He ate lunch at his desk more often than not and used the time to read through the project documentation that had been dumped into a shared folder for him, which was extensive and unevenly organized and told a complicated story about the previous 6 months of operations if you read between the lines. He was building a picture. It was the part of a new job he'd always found privately satisfying, the archaeology of how a place actually functioned versus how it said it functioned. The two were never identical. He saw Victoria in passing 3 times in his first week, once in the main corridor, briefly, with 2 other executives in a conversation that was clearly ongoing and didn't have room for interruption. She nodded at him with the precise neutral warmth that you would extend to any new employee. Once in the elevator, with Sharon Lynn going down while he was going up, the doors opened and there she was, and she said, "Mr. Walker, how's the first week going?" And he said, "Getting there," and the doors closed. The 3rd time, she walked past his office on a Thursday afternoon while he had his door open and glanced in without stopping. He was on the phone. She didn't slow down. He noticed all 3 and told himself he was paying more attention than the situation warranted, which was probably true. The thing that changed the dynamic, when it changed, was not a grand gesture. It was a work issue. He'd been there almost 3 weeks when he flagged a discrepancy in the fulfillment pipeline, a gap between what the intake logs were recording and what the outgoing completion reports showed, a gap that was small enough to be invisible unless you were looking at both sides of the process simultaneously, which he apparently was the first person to do in a while. He ran the numbers twice to make sure he wasn't misreading the data. He wasn't. He wrote it up as a memo and sent it to Gerald Holt. Gerald walked into his office 40 minutes later with the memo printed out and said, "Where did you find this?" Ethan showed him. Gerald stood at his desk looking at the spreadsheet for a long moment. "This has been running for how long?" "Based on the date ranges I can access, at least 9 months. Possibly longer. What's the exposure?" "Rough estimate, around 12 to 15% efficiency loss on that segment. Not catastrophic, but it compounds." Gerald took the printout with him when he left and said he'd be back. He came back 2 hours later and said the executive team wanted a briefing the following morning and would Ethan be prepared to present his findings. Ethan said yes. He spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. The briefing was in the main conference room on 14, the same room as his first interview, though the configuration was different. There were 7 people in the room, including Gerald, Sharon, 2 executives he'd been introduced to but hadn't worked with yet, and Victoria. She was at the far end of the table. She had a notebook open in front of her and a coffee cup that had been refilled recently. She looked at him with the specific attention of someone who had already been briefed on the topic and wanted to watch what he did with it. He walked through the numbers. He kept it clear and precise. Here's the gap. Here's where it lives in the process. Here's what I think is causing it. Here are 3 options for addressing it in order of disruption to current operations. He answered questions. He said, "I don't know the answer to that yet," twice, when the answer was genuinely that he hadn't gotten there, and gave the specific follow-up action he would take to find out. At the end, Victoria said, "How long would option 3 take to implement?" "Full implementation, probably 6 weeks, but we'd see measurable improvement within the first 2 weeks if we hit the critical path correctly." She made a note. "Thank you. Gerald, let's get implementation planning on the calendar for next week." That was it. It was a work meeting. He drove home that evening with the particular satisfaction of a problem identified and moving toward solution. And somewhere underneath that, the awareness that she'd watched him present for 45 minutes, and he still had no clear sense of where they stood outside of the professional context they were both carefully maintaining. The conversation happened on a Thursday, about 5 weeks in. He'd stayed late to finish a review document, and the floor had largely cleared out by 7. He was packing up his bag when he heard footsteps in the corridor and looked up, and Victoria was standing in his doorway in a jacket she was clearly about to leave in, bag over her shoulder. She said, "You're still here." "Just leaving." She stood in the doorway for a moment. There was something slightly different in her posture than in the meeting rooms, a fraction less composed, like a mode she switched out of when the audience was small enough. "I wanted to say something," she said. "About the cafe." He put his bag down. Okay. I recognized you right away, when you sat down. She said it plainly, without apology in the air yet, just establishing the record. I didn't set it up. I really was just there for coffee. But once I knew who you were, I made a decision not to say anything about what I do. Why? She thought about that for a second in a way that suggested she'd already thought about it a lot and was deciding how much of the reasoning to share. Because you were just talking to me, she said, not to whoever you thought I was, and I didn't want that to change. He looked at her. He thought about the 3 hours at the counter, the ease of it, the way the time had moved without pressure. He thought about sitting in the parking garage afterward and feeling, without quite naming it, that something had been unusually good about that afternoon. That's either the most reasonable explanation I've ever heard, he said, or a very good justification. Something flickered in her expression, not quite a smile. Probably both. He considered that. And then I walked into your boardroom, yes, and you acted like we'd never met. I acted like we'd met at a cafe, and I didn't know you well. She held his gaze, which was accurate. He picked his bag back up. He wasn't angry. He'd already decided that somewhere in the past 5 weeks without quite announcing it to himself. But he wanted her to have the experience of saying it out loud rather than letting it sit between them forever, because things that sat between people without being said had a way of quietly changing the shape of everything. All right, he said. All right? She looked slightly unsure, like she'd prepared for more resistance. It made sense. You protected the process. I got the job on the actual merits. He paused. I just wanted to hear you say it. She was quiet for a moment. Fair enough. They walked out together and stood at the elevator bank in the specific light of a building after hours. All the overhead fluorescents still on, but quieter somehow, emptier. He pressed the button. How's your daughter? She asked. She made me practice handshakes with her before my second interview. She is deeply invested in my professional success. Victoria smiled at that. An actual one, not the measured professional version, the one he recognized from the cafe. The elevator came. They both got in. Do you want to have dinner sometime? He said. Not a work thing. She looked at him for a second. The elevator started moving. Yes, she said. Dinner was a Tuesday, a restaurant neither of them had strong feelings about, chosen because it was quiet and nobody from the company was likely to be there. He arrived 3 minutes before she did and ordered water and felt approximately 15 years old, which was not a sensation he'd expected to have at 32. She came in with her hair down, which was the first time he'd seen it that way since the cafe. She sat across from him and looked at the menu and said, I have no idea what I want. And he said, same. And something loosened in the room. They ordered. They talked. Not carefully, the way the previous 5 weeks had been. The dinner had no agenda, no careful delineation of appropriate topics. She asked him more about Lily, and he obliged freely, the way he always did when the interest seemed genuine rather than polite. The stuck-up phase that had lasted 3 months last spring. The phase of extremely detailed drawings of horses that still covered approximately 30% of his refrigerator. The reading. She was ahead of her grade level, which delighted him and also created a problem with book selection because she had strong opinions about stories being good. What counts as a good story to a 7-year-old? Victoria asked. Apparently things have to happen. She has no patience for setup. She's not wrong. She's very confident about what she knows and less confident about what she doesn't, which sounds like a personality flaw, but is actually useful. He paused. Most adults have that inverted. Victoria was quiet for a moment in a way that meant something had landed. What about you? He said. Is there family around? She shook her head. My parents moved back to Taipei when I was 24. I visit. We talk. We're functional, just not close. She said it without self-pity, the way you describe a condition you've made your peace with. I've been mostly on my own since college. That's a long time to run on solo. I had work, she said simply. He looked at her. Is that enough? She picked up her wine glass, held it for a second without drinking. It was for a long time. She met his eyes. I'm not sure it still is. The food came and they ate and talked about the company. Not in the work way, but in the way you talk about a place you both know well and have different relationships to. She told him things about the early years of Nextlara that weren't in any press release. The year she'd had to let 20 people go and had driven home afterward and sat in her parking garage for 40 minutes because she couldn't face walking into her apartment. The board member who had spent 6 months trying to have her replaced and had finally left after a quarter that proved her right so conclusively that even he couldn't argue with it. She told these stories without drama, just the facts of them, like she was reading from a record she had permission to share now because enough time had passed. He noticed that she ate about half of her meal and then seemed to lose interest in it, which he filed away. He noticed she had a habit of touching the base of her wine glass when she was thinking. He noticed the specific way she listened, not waiting for her turn, actually listening, and thought that it was probably rarer than it should be, and possibly one of the things that had made her good at what she did. When the check came, they argued briefly and genuinely about it and split it, which he thought was the right outcome. Outside, it was cold, mid-November, the city doing what it did in the dark, loud and moving and indifferent to anyone's particular evening. They stood on the sidewalk with their jackets on. He had his hands in his pockets. "I'd like to do this again," he said. "Me too. There's a thing next Sunday." He paused. "Lily's school has it's a fall fair thing. It's going to be completely chaotic and probably involve face paint. I was going to say, do you want to come? But I want to be honest, I'm not entirely sure why I'm saying that." She looked at him for a moment with that watching quality. "Because you want to see how it goes?" she said. "Yeah. I'll come." He walked her to her car. They didn't do anything except say goodnight, and that was exactly right for where they were. He walked back to his own car in the cold with his breath coming out visible in the air and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The clean, uncomplicated forward motion of something beginning. He wasn't sure what it was yet. He knew it was something. That was enough for now. The fall fair was exactly what he'd warned her it would be. Lily's school took over the gymnasium and the back courtyard every November. Folding tables, homemade games, a bake sale that ran out of everything worth buying in the first 20 minutes, and at least 2 face painting stations that always had lines stretching back into the hallway. It was loud before you even got through the door. The kind of loud that had no single source, just the accumulated noise of 200 kids and their parents compressing into a space built for half that. Victoria showed up in jeans and a dark green jacket, hair back, and stood next to him at the entrance for a moment, taking it all in. "You weren't exaggerating," she said. "I never exaggerate about chaos." Lily had been bouncing since breakfast. She'd met Victoria once before, briefly, when Victoria had come by the apartment to pick Ethan up for something work-related, and Lily had appeared in the hallway in her pajamas with the natural confidence of a person who owned the building. She'd looked Victoria over and said, "You're tall," which Victoria had taken in stride. That had been 2 weeks ago. Now Lily grabbed Victoria's hand without ceremony and said, "Come on, there's a thing where you knock down cans," and pulled her toward it before Victoria had any real opportunity to respond. Ethan followed them and watched his daughter explain the rules of a beanbag toss to a woman who ran a billion-dollar company, and thought about how certain things didn't prepare you for other things at all. Victoria played 3 rounds. She knocked down more cans than Lily did, which Lily found infuriating in the specific way children find it infuriating when adults are better at something that should belong to kids. She made her displeasure known. Victoria offered to let her win the next round. Lily said she didn't want to win if Victoria was letting her, which Ethan thought was actually a pretty solid principle for a 7-year-old, and Victoria laughed and said, "Fair enough," and they played the 4th round straight. Lily won the 4th round. He couldn't be sure whether that was real or not, and he decided it didn't matter. They spent 2 hours there. Victoria bought 2 things from the bake sale and ate one of them standing at the table and handed the other one to Lily without being asked. She sat on a gymnasium bleacher and listened to Lily explain, at length and with considerable detail, the storyline of a book she'd been reading, and she asked follow-up questions in a way that suggested she was actually following the narrative and not just performing interest. On the drive home, Lily sat in the back seat with her face-painted cheek pressed against the window and said, "I like her." "Yeah?" "She doesn't talk to me like I'm little." He glanced in the rear-view mirror at her. "What do you mean?" Like when adults ask you stuff, but they already decided what you're going to say. She picked at the paper wristband from the fair. She actually listens. He kept his eyes on the road. Good observation. I know, Lily said, and went back to looking out the window. December came in cold and workable. Ethan's pipeline project was 3 weeks into implementation, and the early indicators were moving in the right direction. Not dramatically, not yet, but the 2-week marker he'd described in the briefing was holding. Dara, who had been watchful for the better part of 2 months, stopped by his office one Friday afternoon and said, "The Tuesday numbers are cleaner than they've been in a year," in the tone of someone conceding a point. He thanked her genuinely and meant it, because her buy-in mattered more than the data did in practical terms. He and Victoria had dinner twice more in December. Once at her apartment, she cooked, competently but not easily, the cooking of someone who did it occasionally and paid full attention when she did. Once at a small Italian place she knew. They were building the specific vocabulary of two people who were becoming real to each other. The accumulated small knowledge of habits and history and how a person occupies space when they're not performing for anyone. He learned that she slept badly and had since her mid-20s, that she compensated with an unreasonable amount of coffee, and that she was aware this was not a solution. He learned that she had strong opinions about bad writing and would put a book down 3 chapters in without guilt, which was a position he found oddly reassuring. He learned that she was harder on herself than on anyone around her, which he suspected was part of why she'd built something impressive, and also part of why she seemed, at certain angles, quietly tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She learned his habits too, that he was a planner by necessity rather than nature, someone who would have preferred to be more spontaneous, but had organized his life around a child for 7 years, and the instinct was now structural, that he had a very dry sense of humor that he mostly kept to himself at work, but didn't bother suppressing otherwise. That he worried about Lily in the specific baseline, ever-present way of a parent who had always been the only parent, and that this worry was not a crisis, but a condition. They were careful at work, professionally distant in the exact way that was appropriate, neither avoiding each other nor giving anyone anything to look at. He reported to Gerald, not to Victoria, which helped. They were not a story at work. They were two people who knew each other outside of it, and they both understood, without discussing it at length, why keeping those things separate mattered. What they didn't account for was how small the company actually was when the wrong person was paying attention. He found out about it from Dara. It was a Wednesday in the 2nd week of January. He was in the break room pouring coffee when she came in, got her own cup, and then stood by the counter without leaving the way she usually did. He said, "Something you need to tell me?" She looked at him for a second. "There's talk," she said, "about you and Hayes." He kept his expression neutral. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that says you got the job because she liked you personally. That the whole hiring process was a formality." She set her cup down. "Someone posted about it on an internal forum. Anonymous. It's been circulating since yesterday." He was quiet for a moment. "How widely?" "Enough that 3 people mentioned it to me this morning. And I'm not someone who usually gets brought gossip," which meant it had moved past the gossip tier and into something people were treating as information worth sharing with someone in his orbit. He understood the difference. He didn't like it, but he understood it. "What's the tone?" he said. "Skeptical. Some of it is just the usual speculation people run when someone moves fast in a new role, but some of it is pointed." She paused. "The post specifically said Hayes had a personal relationship with you before the hire and didn't disclose it. It used those words. Didn't disclose." The framing mattered. That was not idle gossip. That was a specific, structured accusation, and whoever had written it knew the difference. Ethan stood there for a second, thinking about who that could be, and decided that was a problem for later. "Thank you for telling me," he said. Dara picked up her cup. "I've worked here for 4 years. I know what you found in that pipeline data. I know how long it had been sitting there before you walked in." She met his eyes once. "For what it's worth." She left. He stood in the break room for a moment, then poured out half his coffee because he didn't need it, and went back to his office and closed the door. He didn't go to Victoria that day. He thought about it and decided it was the wrong move. Not because he wanted to avoid her, but because going to her immediately looked like exactly the kind of thing the accusation implied. Two people coordinating around a shared problem that they'd created together. He called his sister that evening instead. She was 3 hours behind in Portland and picked up on the fourth ring sounding like she'd been in the middle of something. "Bad time?" he said. "No, talk. What happened?" He told her the short version. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Did you know who she was before the interview?" "No, I found out when I walked into the room." "And you didn't say anything to the panel?" "It didn't feel right to use it." His sister made a noise that meant she was working through the logic of this. "Okay, so the accusation is that she gave you the job because of a personal connection. The actual story is that she already knew you when she reviewed your application and didn't use that to help you." "That's the actual story, yeah. That's either going to protect you completely or it's going to be very hard to explain to people who've already made up their minds." He already knew that. "I know. What are you going to do?" "Right now, nothing. I'm going to wait and see how it develops." "And her?" He looked at the window, Lily's drawings on the refrigerator and the edge of his peripheral vision. "I don't know yet." His sister said, "Ethan, you like her." He didn't answer. "That's not a question," she said. "I know it's not." She was quiet for a moment. "Just don't make decisions out of guilt, about the job or about her." He said he wouldn't. He wasn't sure it was true. Victoria found out about the forum post the same day he did, via Sharon Lynn, who sent her a screenshot and 2 lines of context. She read it once and then set her phone face down on her desk and sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. She already knew what was coming. She'd run the company long enough to understand how these things moved, how an accusation, once it found a shape, would grow to fit whatever space it was put in. It didn't matter that it was false. It didn't matter that the hiring panel's notes were detailed and consistent and showed Ethan's scores clearly. It mattered that the story was simple and the evidence required context. She called Sharon into her office and said, "I need a complete documentation pull of the full hiring process for Ethan Walker. Interview scores, panel notes, comparative assessments, everything. Have it ready for me by end of day." Sharon said she'd have it in 2 hours. "And find out who administers the internal forum," Victoria said. "I want to know who posted." Sharon nodded and left. Victoria stood at the window for a moment. The city was gray and flat under January clouds, the way it got in the deep part of winter, the time of year she'd always liked least. She thought about the fall fair and the way Ethan had watched Lily pull her toward the beanbag toss with a particular expression. Not pride exactly, something more complicated than that. The look of a person watching 2 things they cared about occupy the same space and finding it unexpectedly good. She thought about being in the interview room and watching him answer Gerald's questions without ever trying to leverage the fact that they'd spent 3 hours talking 4 days earlier. Not once. Not even a flicker of it in his eyes. She thought about the forum post and the phrase "didn't disclose," and she understood what was happening even before the board meeting confirmed it. Gosh. The board meeting was requested by 2 members and scheduled for the following Monday. Gerald Holt walked into her office on Thursday to tell her about it, which meant he'd heard before she had and had come to give her time to prepare, which was one of the things she respected about Gerald, even when it came attached to information she didn't want. "It's a process review," he said. "Technically, they want to examine the hiring protocol and whether existing conflict of interest provisions were followed." "They weren't violated," she said. "I know that. You know that. The documentation supports that." He paused. "But someone on that board asked for the meeting, Victoria. That's not nothing." "Who?" He told her. She'd known it was possible. She'd had 3 years of friction with this particular board member, a man named Harlan Cross, who had joined the board during a capital round 2 years ago and had never fully reconciled himself to a company he'd invested in but didn't control. He'd tried twice before to make things uncomfortable, and had both times been outmaneuvered by results. This time, he had a different kind of leverage. "What do they need?" she said. "Full transparency on the process, timeline of contact between you and Walker, documentation of your recusal from final hiring decisions." She nodded slowly. "I didn't recuse myself formally because there was nothing to recuse from." The cafe encounter was personal and undisclosed because it had no bearing on the process. That's the position we take into Monday, Gerald said. He looked at her steadily. But Victoria, you need to think about whether continuing contact with him during the investigation creates more exposure. She looked at the window. Yes, she said. I've already thought about that. She called him that night. He picked up on the second ring. I know, he said. How much? Enough. Dara told me about the forum. I figured the board wasn't far behind. She could hear that he'd been sitting with this for a while, the tone of someone who had worked through the initial reaction and arrived at something quieter. I have to be transparent with the board about our contact, she said. Timeline, nature, all of it. There's no version of this where I don't. I know. And while the investigation is active, we can't... She stopped. The sentence felt wrong regardless of how she finished it. We need to not be in contact outside of work. For the duration. He was quiet for a moment. I understand, he said. His voice was even. That was somehow harder to hear than anger would have been. Ethan, she paused. I need you to know that this investigation is going to confirm what actually happened. The documentation is complete. Your scores are what they are. No one on that panel did anything improper. I know that too. So this is temporary. Another pause. I know, he said again, quieter this time. Doesn't make it easier. No, she said. It doesn't. She wanted to say something else and couldn't find it. The right words for a situation that didn't have precedent in her experience. A situation that was professionally navigable and personally raw in a way she was not accustomed to. She had spent most of her adult life being very competent about hard things. This particular hard thing was not responding to competence. Take care of yourself, she said finally. You too. She hung up and sat in her apartment in the quiet, which was the kind of quiet that had always been fine before and was less fine now, and she understood the distinction well enough to find it inconvenient. Quote, the weeks that followed had a specific texture that Ethan had not experienced before. He went to work. He managed his team, who were now past the initial phase of evaluation and were beginning to function with the kind of low-friction efficiency that meant the early work had been worth doing. He finished the pipeline implementation and ran the 30-day report, which showed a 14% improvement on the targeted segment, which he documented carefully and sent to Gerald without fanfare. He did his job well. He did it well every day, partly because he always had, and partly because he understood clearly that his work was now evidence, and that evidence needed to be clean. He saw Victoria in meetings, twice a week, sometimes 3 times, depending on what was running. She looked at him with the same professional neutrality she'd used in the earliest weeks, and he used it back, and neither of them made it look like effort. He was fairly sure it took effort for both of them. Lily noticed something was off. She didn't ask directly. She was 7, not oblivious, and she'd learned at some point that the best information came from observation rather than interrogation. She just watched him more carefully for a while, and once, on a Saturday morning when he was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee looking at nothing, she climbed onto the chair across from him and said, "Are you okay?" He looked at her. "Yeah, just tired." "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The one you do when something's wrong but you don't want to say." He looked at his coffee. "I've got some stuff at work I'm sorting out. It's fine." "Is it the company stuff?" She said it carefully, in a way that meant she'd overheard more than he'd intended. "A little bit." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Victoria coming on Sunday?" "Not this week." "Oh." A pause. "Is she okay?" "Yeah, she's okay. She's just got a lot going on." Lily seemed to consider whether this was the full story and decided not to push it. "Okay," she said, and got down from the chair and went back to what she'd been doing, with the particular grace of a kid who knew when to let something be. He sat there a little longer after that, in the quiet apartment, in the mid-January gray, with the feeling of something being on hold that he couldn't control, a suspension that was professional in origin and personal in consequence, and that required a patience he was not entirely sure he had. He had it anyway. He didn't see another option. The investigation was running, the documentation was there. The truth was what it was. He went back to work on Monday, and the Monday after that, and kept doing what he did, The investigation ran for 6 weeks. Ethan knew this not because anyone told him directly, but because he was paying attention, and the signals were readable if you knew where to look. The HR director's door was closed more than usual. Certain calendar invitations disappeared from shared scheduling threads. 2 of the board members he recognized from the initial interview were in the building on a Tuesday when they typically weren't, which meant something was being reviewed in person rather than remotely, which meant the process was in an active phase. He kept his head down and did his work. That was all he could do, and he knew it. The 30-day pipeline report had already gone to Gerald. In the second week of February, he completed the 60-day review, and the numbers had continued to move. 17% improvement on the original segment, with a secondary effect on a downstream process he hadn't targeted initially, but that had responded to the upstream changes anyway. He wrote it up the same way he always did. Specific, plain, no inflation. He sent it to Gerald and copied the relevant team leads and went back to the next thing. Dara knocked on his office door that afternoon and said, 60-day numbers are good. They are, he said. The downstream effect is interesting. You see that coming? Not specifically. I saw that the segment was connected to it. I didn't know how strong the link was until the data came back. She considered that. Honest answer. I try. She stood in the doorway for a second, and he had the sense that she'd come to say something beyond the numbers. She was not a person who stopped by for small talk. People are starting to see the work, she said finally. Whatever else is happening, people on the floor are starting to separate that from you. He looked at her. I appreciate you saying that. She nodded once and left. That was Dara. Economy and everything, no more than the thing required. He'd learned to read her early on and had come to value her precision. That she'd made the effort to say it at all meant something. But the investigation findings came out on a Thursday in the 3rd week of February. He found out in stages the way you find out about things that happen above your direct line of sight. The first stage was Gerald Holt appearing in his office doorway at 2 in the afternoon and saying, "You have a few minutes?" Ethan put down what he was working on. Yes. Gerald came in and sat down across from him, which he rarely did. He was a man who delivered things standing, as a rule. The fact that he sat down told Ethan this was going to take more than 30 seconds. The board completed its review this morning, Gerald said. I want to tell you directly before the formal communication goes out. Ethan waited. The investigation found no impropriety in the hiring process. Your scores, first round, second round, combined assessment, were the highest of any candidate. The panel's documentation is consistent and complete. There's no evidence that your personal acquaintance with the CEO influenced the outcome in any material way. Gerald paused. The board has formally cleared both you and Hayes of any procedural violation. Ethan absorbed this without immediate reaction. He'd believed it would come out this way. He'd had to believe that, or he would not have been able to sit at his desk for 6 weeks and do his job without the whole thing becoming something else. Believing it and hearing it confirmed were different experiences. The individuals who originated the forum posts, Gerald continued, have been identified. 3 employees. 2 are being placed on formal performance review for conduct violations. The 3rd, who authored the original post, is being terminated. Who was it? Gerald looked at him levelly. That's not something I'm going to share. Ethan nodded. He hadn't really expected a name. Harlan Cross? Gerald's expression didn't change. The board's internal composition and any individual member's roles in requesting the review are not something I'm in a position to discuss with you. Which was an answer. Is Cross still on the board? Ethan said. The board's membership is public information, Gerald said. He stood up. Formal communication will come from Sharon Lynn's office later today. I wanted you to hear it from a person first. He extended his hand. Ethan shook it. For what it's worth, Gerald said, I told the panel in your second interview that you were the right candidate. I told them again during the review. He paused at the door. The numbers you've been producing since you started have made that a fairly easy position to maintain. He left. Ethan sat alone in his office for a moment. Outside his window, the city was doing its mid-February thing, gray and cold and functional. He thought about the 6 weeks. The mornings he'd driven in knowing the investigation was somewhere in the building above him. The twice-weekly meetings where he and Victoria had sat in the same room and treated each other with a careful professionalism that was accurate and insufficient at the same time. Lily asking, twice more since that Saturday, whether Victoria was coming on Sunday. The way he'd answered both times. He picked up his phone, he looked at it for a second, then he put it back down. He wanted to call her, but the formal communication hadn't gone out yet, and he didn't know where things stood between them outside of work. And calling her in the 2-hour window between Gerald's visit and the official notice felt like jumping a signal. He went back to work. The email from Sharon Lynn came at 4:45. The company-wide meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. It was framed as a quarterly update, which was partly true. There was a full business review component, projections for the coming quarter, team recognitions. But everyone in the building understood that it was also a formal close of the investigation. A drawing of a line, and an attempt to move past 6 weeks of internal turbulence without leaving the wound open. Ethan was not scheduled to speak. He was in the room as an attendee along with the rest of his floor, seated in the middle section of the auditorium-style space on the second floor that Nextlara used for all-hands events. He had a notebook he wasn't writing in, and a coffee he'd finished 20 minutes before the meeting started. Victoria opened the meeting. She was at the front of the room with a presentation behind her and the particular composure she always brought to public-facing moments. Structured, unhurried, the kind of presence that made a large room feel organized just by occupying it. She went through the business review segment with the directness that people in the company had come to expect from her. Numbers, progress, honest assessment of where things were behind target and what the path looked like. Then she got to the investigation. She addressed it directly, which he hadn't been sure she would. She said the company had conducted a thorough review of its hiring processes, that the review had been completed, and that the findings confirmed all established protocols had been followed correctly. She named the pipeline project by name and said it had produced the kind of early results that validated the decision. She said the conduct violations had been addressed. She said this clearly and without excessive language, without making it a speech about integrity or values or any of the other territory that turns a factual statement into a performance. She was about to transition back to the business segment. Ethan stood up. He hadn't planned it. Or rather, he'd been sitting with something for 2 weeks since Gerald's visit, a specific thought that had been circling him without resolution, and at some point in the previous 48 hours he'd stopped trying to talk himself out of it. He stood up in the middle of the room without being called on, and 300 people turned to look at him. Victoria looked at him. Her expression was completely unreadable. He said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say something." A room full of people waiting. "My name is Ethan Walker. I manage the fulfillment operations team on the 14th floor." He kept his voice even. "Most of you know what the last several weeks have been about. I'm not going to relitigate any of it. The record speaks for itself, and you've all just heard what the record says." He paused. "What I want to say is this." He looked at Victoria. Not with the professional neutrality of the past 6 weeks, just looked at her. "Before I ever walked into an interview at this company, there was a person who sat across from me at a coffee counter and treated me like someone worth talking to. Not a resume, not a candidate, a person." He stopped for a second. "I found out later that she already knew who I was, that she was already looking at my application when she chose not to tell me who she was. And instead of using that connection to grease the process in any direction, for me or against me, she did nothing except make sure the process was clean. No one in the room was moving. I got this job because I earned it, I know that. But I'm standing up here because I want to say thank you to the person who made sure the evidence that I earned it was protected, even when protecting it cost her something." He paused. "That's the kind of leadership I don't think gets named enough. And it deserved to be named." He sat down. The silence lasted about 3 full seconds. Then someone near the back started clapping, and it moved through the room with the particular speed of something people had been waiting to express. He looked at the notebook in his lap. He was aware that his heart rate was about 20 beats above normal and that approximately 300 people were clapping in his direction, and he found he had no good response to either condition. He didn't see her in the room afterward. The crowd dispersed quickly, and he was stopped by 4 different people on his way to the exit. two of whom he knew and two of whom introduced themselves as colleagues from other departments who wanted to say they appreciated what he'd said. He spoke to all of them and extricated himself without being rude and got himself out of the main flow of foot traffic and stood in a corridor near the east stairwell, just catching his breath. His phone buzzed. A text. My office, 15 minutes. He stood there for a second, looking at the message. Then he went. Her office was on the 16th floor, and the last time he'd been in it was for an executive briefing 2 months ago, surrounded by 4 other people. It was a large room, but not an ostentatious one. A desk, a conference table for 6, bookshelves that had actual books on them, and not just objects meant to signal that she read. The city spread out behind her through the windows. She was standing at the windows when he came in. She heard the door and turned around. She looked tired, not in the way of a person who hadn't slept, in the way of a person who had been carrying something for a long time and had recently set it down and hadn't quite adjusted to the absence of the weight. Her hair was down. He realized he associated that with her being off guard, or something closer to herself than the public version. That was unexpected, she said. I know. You didn't have to do that. I know, he said again. She looked at him for a moment. You're not going to explain yourself? I said what I wanted to say. It's all still accurate. She crossed her arms. Not defensively, more like she needed something to do with them. The board is going to read that as a statement of solidarity between us. Let them read it however they want. I told the truth in front of 300 people. That's a lot harder to undermine than an anonymous forum post. She seemed to be working through several responses at once, which was unusual. She was generally a person who knew which response she wanted. The not quite knowing was visible. Harlan Cross submitted his board resignation this morning, she said. Gerald didn't tell me that. Gerald didn't know at 9 a.m. She paused. The meeting went badly for him in several directions. Yours was just the last one. Ethan nodded slowly. Good. She almost smiled at that, just at the edges. Then it faded. 6 weeks, she said. I kept thinking about the Sunday fair and all those ridiculous homemade games. And every time I had to sit across from you in a briefing and not... She stopped. I am not good at this, at the personal part of things. I need you to know that up front. I've had some time to notice that. I'm telling you directly. I heard you. She looked at him. The winter light from the windows was gray and flat, and it did nothing to make the room feel easier, and neither of them moved toward the other, but something in the space between them had changed. The careful professional distance had done what it was supposed to do, and it was done now, and what was left was whatever had been there before it. Lily asked about you, he said. Both Sundays. Something moved in her face. What did you tell her? That you were busy, that you were okay. She was quiet for a second. Was that the truth? The first part was. She uncrossed her arms. She looked out the window for a moment at the gray city, and then back at him. I'd like to see her on Sunday, she said. If that's still... Yes, he said. It came out without hesitation because that was where the answer was. She nodded. Okay. They stood there for another moment in the quiet office, not saying much, not needing to. The 6 weeks had been what they were, necessary, controlled, miserable in the specific way of things that cost you something real. And they were over. He said, I should let you finish your day. Probably. He went to the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, you handled the whole thing right. The recusal, the documentation, all of it. You did everything the way it needed to be done. She looked at him steadily. So did you. He left. He rode the elevator back down to 14 and walked to his office and stood at his own window for a minute, looking at the same city from a different angle, thinking about the shape of the past several months, from the cafe to the boardroom to the fall fair to the months in between, and everything that had been built and tested and apparently survived the testing. He wasn't certain of everything yet. He was certain of enough. The following Sunday, Victoria showed up at the apartment at 11 in the morning with a bag of groceries, which she hadn't mentioned beforehand. Ethan opened the door and looked at the bag and said, Are you cooking? I thought I'd try, she said. You thought you'd try. I have a recipe I've done before. It mostly worked. Mostly. The second time was better than the first. He stepped back from the door and let her in. Lily appeared from the hallway at the sound of voices, still in her Saturday socks with the non-slip dots on the bottom, and stopped when she saw Victoria. Victoria crouched down to eye level. She did this without making it a gesture, just the practical thing of meeting a person where they were. "Hey," she said, "I brought stuff to make lunch. Do you want to help?" Lily looked at the bag. "What are we making?" "Pasta, the kind with the sauce that takes a while." "I know how to stir," Lily said, with the authority of someone establishing credentials. "Good," Victoria said. "I need a stir." Lily looked at her for a second with those watchful eyes. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned and led the way to the kitchen like she was showing someone around her office. Ethan watched the two of them disappear around the corner. He stood in the entryway for a moment with the front door still open, the cold February air coming in from the hallway. Then he closed the door and followed them into the kitchen. The pasta took longer than expected because Lily had strong opinions about the stirring technique, and Victoria had strong opinions about the heat level, and the two of them spent approximately 12 minutes in a low-stakes disagreement about whether you could stir too fast. Ethan stayed out of it. He sat at the kitchen counter and drank his coffee and watched the two of them argue over a pot of sauce with the focused energy of people who both believed they were right, and he thought that this was one of the stranger and better things he had seen in recent memory. "You're going too fast," Victoria said. "It's not going fast enough," Lily said. "If you stir that fast, you break up the tomatoes." Lily stopped stirring for exactly 1 second to look at her. "What if I want them broken up?" Victoria opened her mouth and then closed it. She looked at Ethan. "Don't look at me," he said. "She's your daughter." "She's currently the head chef. I don't outrank her in this kitchen." Lily went back to stirring at exactly the same speed as before, with the satisfaction of someone who had won a procedural point. Victoria leaned against the counter beside her with her arms crossed and watched the pot. And after a moment she started smiling despite herself. Not the measured version, the real one, the one that reached her eyes. And Ethan filed it away in the category of things he didn't want to forget. Lunch was good, not perfect. The pasta was slightly overdone and the sauce was a little thick, and they ran out of the good Parmesan before everyone had enough. But it was good in the way that meals cooked with other people are good regardless of the technical outcome, because the point was never really the food. They ate at the kitchen table with afternoon light coming through the window, the three of them, and Lily talked for most of the meal about a project she was doing at school about animals that lived underground, which led to a 10-minute conversation about whether moles were interesting or unpleasant. And Victoria took the position that moles were deeply interesting from an engineering standpoint, which was not the angle Ethan had expected and which caused Lily to look at her with something that had moved clearly past approval into respect. After lunch, while Lily was occupied with the animal project at the coffee table, Victoria helped him wash the dishes. She was not an efficient dishwasher. She thought about things while she washed, which meant she moved at about 60% speed and sometimes stopped entirely. But she was thorough, and he didn't mind the pace. They stood at the sink together in the quiet that happens when the meal is done and the afternoon hasn't decided what it's going to be yet. "This is nice," she said. She said it simply, without decoration, like a factual observation she was making to herself as much as to him. "Yeah," he said. "I don't do this much." "Cook?" "Any of it." She handed him a wet pot. "The Sunday part. Just being somewhere that isn't mine with people who aren't professional contacts." She paused. "That sounds more isolated than I mean it to." "Does it?" She was quiet for a second. "Maybe it's exactly as isolated as it sounds." He dried the pot and set it on the counter and didn't say anything to that, because sometimes the most honest response to someone telling you a hard truth about themselves is to just let it be said. Let it take up the space it needs, instead of rushing in with reassurance that makes it smaller. She handed him another dish. "I've been thinking about what you said at the meeting." "Which part?" "The part about how I treated you at the cafe." She kept her eyes on the water. "You made it sound like a generous thing. I've been wondering if it was actually just avoidance. I didn't tell you who I was because I didn't want the dynamic to change. But that was for me, not for you." He thought about that. "I think both things can be true." That's a very reasonable position. You sound annoyed by that. I'm annoyed at myself. I spent 6 weeks in an investigation that caused you real professional damage, and part of the foundation for it was a choice I made at a coffee counter because I liked talking to someone who didn't know my title. She rinsed her hands. That has a cost that was mostly yours, not mine. He set down the dish towel. Can I say something? She looked at him. If you told me who you were at the cafe, I would have been different. I would have been careful. Everything I said would have been filtered through the fact that you were going to be on the other side of my interview in 4 days. He paused. The version of me you hired was the version you met when I didn't know any of that. I'm not sure that's a bad trade. She looked at him for a long moment. Even with everything that followed? Even with that? She didn't say anything. She turned back to the sink and pulled the drain plug and watched the water go down, and he recognized the expression she had. The particular look of a person who has been carrying an argument with themselves for a long time and has just heard something that makes it harder to continue. From the living room, Lily's voice. Victoria, do moles have good eyesight? Victoria straightened up. No, she called back. Almost none. They navigate by feel. A pause. That sounds scary. It works for them, Victoria said. They know their tunnels. Lily seemed to accept this and went back to her project. Ethan looked at Victoria. You're good with her, he said. She makes it easy. She really doesn't with most people. Victoria picked up the dish towel he'd set down and dried her hands with the absent-minded thoroughness of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere. I wasn't good with kids before. I didn't know how to talk to them. I either talked down or I talked over, which is the same failure from different directions. She folded the towel. Lily doesn't let you do either. She just waits until you figure out the right register. She does that. It's a useful skill. A small pause. She's a good person. You did that. He didn't respond to that immediately, because the truth was he felt the weight of it in the way compliments about Lily always landed differently than compliments about anything else. Deeper, and with a complicated undertow. He had done some things right. He had also gotten things wrong, more than he liked to count, and the distance between who he wanted to be as a father and who he actually was on any given Tuesday was not always small. I'm trying, he said. That's not a small thing. It doesn't always feel like enough. She looked at him steadily. I know, but from where I'm standing, it's enough. But spring came in stages, the way it always did in that city. 1 week warm, the next week cold again, the trees making decisions about blooming and then reconsidering. Ethan had been at Nextlara for 7 months by the time the weather settled into something consistent, and the shape of his work life had clarified from the uncertain terrain of a new position into something with structure and direction. The pipeline project had been absorbed into standard operations, and he had moved on to a larger initiative, a cross-departmental integration project that Gerald had brought to him in March. Something that had been stalled for a year because nobody had been able to get the relevant teams to function without friction. It was messier than the pipeline work. It involved people with competing priorities and a history of unresolved disagreements, and progress was not clean or fast. He liked it more than the cleaner work, actually. The resistance was honest. His team had changed in the months since he'd started. Not the roster, mostly. A few departures, one new hire he'd brought in and felt good about. But the way the team operated. The daily friction had dropped. Dara had shifted from watchful evaluator to something that functioned like a working alliance, which he valued more than any specific output. Curtis, who had spent the first 2 months asking questions that were really tests, had stopped testing and started just asking, which was more efficient for everyone. He had not fixed everything. He had made mistakes. A timeline he'd projected too aggressively, a staffing decision that had seemed right, and had created a problem he'd had to spend 6 weeks solving. He owned those plainly, documented what he'd learned, and moved forward. He had found, slowly, that being wrong about something and saying so directly was not as costly as he'd been conditioned to believe. In the right environment, it was actually clarifying. He and Victoria had found the rhythm of them. That was how he thought about it. Not a label, not a defined thing with an official status, but a rhythm. Dinner when schedules allowed, which was not every week and sometimes not for 2 weeks. because she ran a company and he managed a complex project, and they both had lives that made competing demands. The Sundays when it worked, the phone calls late in the evening when Lily was asleep, and they talked about the week or nothing in particular, the way you talk to someone who has become part of your internal furniture. Not performance, just presence. She was not easy. He had known that early and had not been wrong about it. She kept things close until they couldn't stay close anymore, and the release was never graceful. She would say a thing she'd been holding for 2 weeks and then immediately look like she regretted saying it, and he had to learn when to press and when to give her room to come back around on her own. She worked too much and knew it and didn't fully stop. She had opinions about things that she held with a conviction that sometimes made conversation feel more like a deposition, and she was occasionally very difficult to tell anything she didn't want to hear. He was not easy either. He had a wall that went up when he felt crowded, a wall built from years of managing things alone, and it went up fastest when he least wanted it to. He was impatient with inefficiency, and sometimes extended that impatience to people who hadn't done anything wrong. He had a habit of solving problems before being asked to, which was useful at work and occasionally condescending outside of it. And Victoria had said this to him directly one evening in April in a way that was uncomfortable and accurate. "You do this thing," she'd said, "where you've already decided what the problem is and what to do about it before I finish the sentence. I was trying to help." "I know, but sometimes I'm just telling you something. I'm not always presenting a problem to be managed." He'd sat with that for a moment. "Okay, point taken. I'm not trying to—" "No, you're right," he said. "I do that. I'll work on it." She'd looked slightly surprised that he hadn't defended himself more. He understood the surprise, that a lot of people would have. But he was 32 years old and had spent years learning things about himself he didn't always like, and one of them was that defensiveness in the face of accurate feedback was a luxury that cost more than it was worth. That was the shape of them. Not smooth. Not a story where two people made each other better by proximity alone, as if love were a renovation project. More like two people who had both spent a long time being only themselves, and were now in the slow, ungraceful process of learning how to include someone else in the load-bearing parts. Lily turned 8 in June. She had a party in the park, her specific request, because she wanted to run around and there wasn't room for that in the apartment. 6 kids from school, a banner that Ethan had bought and Lily had insisted on rehanging twice because the first time wasn't level, and a cake from the bakery on Clement Street that had a mole on it wearing a hard hat, which had been Lily's specific request and which the bakery had executed with more earnestness than he'd expected. Victoria came. She showed up with a wrapped present that turned out to be a set of field guides, birds, insects, trees, and one specifically about tunneling mammals, which caused Lily to look at her with an expression that said, "This woman understands me," and a container of the sauce from the February pasta, which she'd made again and brought because Lily had requested it 3 weeks earlier. The party was loud and only somewhat organized, the way children's parties are when no adult is willing to be strict about structure. 2 kids got into a disagreement about the rules of a game that didn't have established rules. Someone's juice box ended up on the cake table. Lily ran the whole afternoon with the focused intensity of a person managing an event that mattered to her. And when the energy finally flagged in the late afternoon and the other kids started drifting back toward their parents, she collapsed onto the blanket next to Victoria and said, "I'm extremely tired." "That makes sense," Victoria said. "You've been moving for 3 hours." "It was a good party." "It was a great party." Lily turned her head to look at her sideways. "Did you have good birthday parties when you were a kid?" Victoria was quiet for a second. "Some years. Other years my parents were busy and it was more low-key." "That sounds sad." "It was what it was." She paused. "This is better than most of mine." Lily seemed to file this information away with her customary seriousness. She rolled onto her back and looked at the sky, which was doing what late afternoon June skies do, going gold at the edges, clouds moving slowly. "Are you going to be around a lot?" Lily asked. "What do you mean?" "Like, a lot, not just sometimes." Victoria looked at Ethan, who was across the blanket pretending to be very interested in the remaining cake. He was absolutely listening. "I'd like to be," Victoria said. Lily considered that. "Okay." She said it with the air of someone who has reviewed a proposal and found it acceptable. And then she sat up and said, "I want more cake," and went to get it, and left the two of them on the blanket in the late afternoon light. Ethan looked at Victoria. She looked at him. "She's going to be a CEO someday," he said. "I know." Victoria pulled her knees up. "It's slightly intimidating. Imagine having her as your kid." "I'm starting to," she said quietly. He looked at her. She met his eyes, and the thing that had been building since February, not a decision exactly, more like an accumulation, settled into something clearer. Not yet, but soon. Us. The project milestone that summer was the cross-departmental integration, and it closed in August. Not cleanly, not on the original timeline, not without 3 weeks in June that Ethan would describe afterward as the most professionally frustrating of his tenure at Nextlara. But it closed. The two teams that had been operating in parallel without meaningful coordination were, by August, operating as something that functioned like a single unit. Not frictionless, functional, which was the goal. Gerald called him in and told him the executive committee wanted to move his title. The word permanent was used in relation to his role, along with an expanded scope and a salary adjustment that he processed with the same practice neutrality he'd used when Sharon Lynn first gave him numbers over the phone last fall, and with the same private internal shift that followed when the call ended. He called his sister that evening. "I got the executive role," he said. She made a sound of genuine satisfaction. "I knew you would." "I didn't." "I know you didn't. That's why I didn't tell you." He laughed despite himself. "That logic doesn't work." "It absolutely works. You do better when you're slightly uncertain. It keeps you honest." He wasn't sure she was wrong. He was also aware that the conversation he actually needed to have was not this one, was not the work update, which was good news he was grateful for, but something else he'd been circling around for the better part of 3 months. "I'm going to ask her," he said. His sister was quiet for a second. "Victoria." "Yes." "Is she ready for that?" "I don't know," he said honestly. I think we're both in that place where you know you're not going anywhere. But sometimes knowing that and saying it formally are different things for different people. And I don't know exactly where she is on the gap between those two things." "Well, what does your gut say?" He thought about the birthday party blanket, about the February Sunday in the kitchen, about every conversation they'd had late at night when she'd say something true about herself that was hard to say, and then keep going anyway, because she'd decided he was worth the discomfort of being known. He thought about what she'd said on the blanket in the park. "I'm starting to." "My gut says she's there," he said. "I just don't know if she knows she's there yet." "So make it easy to say yes," his sister said. "Don't make it a big production. Make it something that feels like the next real thing, not a performance." He thought about that for a long time after he hung up. October came back around, a year from the interview. The anniversary had no official status. There was no date marked on a calendar, no agreement between them that it meant anything, but Ethan was aware of it anyway, in the way you are aware of the dates that change the shape of your life, not because you observe them, but because they observe you. He made a reservation at Cedar and Cup on a Thursday afternoon. Not the full restaurant. The cafe didn't do reservations. That wasn't the kind of place it was. He just asked the owner, a quiet man named Frank who had been running the counter for 20 years, whether the 2 seats at the far end of the counter could be held for an hour on Saturday evening. Frank looked at him. "You want to reserve 2 stools at a coffee counter," Frank said. "Yes." Frank looked at him for another second. "What time?" 7. Frank thought about it. "Saturday nights are slow. Fine. But you're buying dinner." "I was going to anyway." He didn't tell Victoria anything specific. He said he wanted to show her something Saturday evening. She asked what. He said it was the place where they'd started. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay." Saturday was cool and clear, the specific October quality of that city in early fall. The air with a sharp edge to it, the light going golden fast in the late afternoon and giving way to dark quickly. He picked her up at 7. She was in a dark coat he hadn't seen before, hair down, and she looked at him when she got into the car with a slight question in her expression that he didn't answer. They drove. She recognized the street before he parked. "Cedar and Cup?" she said. "Yeah." She was quiet for a second. "It's been a year." "Approximately. That's why we're here." "Partially," he said. They went in. Frank had held the two stools at the end of the counter with a small reserved card that he removed with the unceremonious efficiency of a man who had done a favor and considered it complete. The cafe was quiet. A couple at the window table, a man reading near the door, the low sound of something instrumental from the speakers above the counter. It smelled like coffee and something baked earlier in the day. They sat. Frank brought them coffee without being asked, which Ethan had also arranged in advance. Victoria looked around the space. He watched her do it, the small recalibration of a person placing themselves in a memory, finding the distances different than they remember, the light a different angle. "I was sitting 2 stools that way," she said, pointing left of her current seat. "You were here." "I was here." "You said you were there for the coffee and because you needed somewhere to sit." Both were true. "I already knew who you were." She looked at him sideways. "I was very calm about it." "Were you?" "Outwardly." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "Internally, I was doing math very fast about how to handle the next 5 minutes." "How'd that go?" "I asked about the coffee. It seemed low stakes." He smiled. "It was a good opener." She looked at the counter, at the surface of it, the wear marks, the rings from 1,000 cups, the kind of thing that accumulates over years of use. "I've thought about this place a lot," she said, "in the last year. What would have happened if I'd been somewhere else that afternoon?" "I'd have found some other cafe." "You wouldn't have found me." "No." She was quiet. "I didn't know what I was walking into. I thought I was getting coffee on a Tuesday." A pause. "I wasn't expecting any of it." He put his coffee cup down. He reached into his jacket pocket. He'd been carrying the ring for 6 days, since Wednesday, when he'd picked it up from the jeweler he'd spent 3 weeks working with to get the design right. Not elaborate, not trying to be something it wasn't. A simple band, a single stone. The kind of thing she would actually wear. He set it on the counter between them. She looked at it. He said, "I walked in here looking for a cup of coffee." He paused. "I never expected to find my future." She didn't move for a moment. He watched her face, watched the thing that moved through it, the slow arrival of something she'd been approaching for a long time and had maybe been afraid to arrive at, and the arrival itself, the moment it landed. Her eyes were bright when she looked at him. Not crying yet, close to it. "That's a good line," she said, and her voice was slightly unsteady. "I've been sitting on it for a while." "How long?" "Since about February." He met her eyes. "Victoria, I know you don't do things simply. I know this is going to be complicated and imperfect, and we're both going to do things that drive each other insane." He paused. "I also know that I don't want to build the next part of my life without you in it, and I'm fairly sure you feel the same way." She looked at the ring on the counter. She looked at him. "I'm not good at this," she said quietly. It was the same thing she'd said in her office in February. A warning, or maybe just the truth offered plainly. "I know," he said. "Neither am I. I work too much. I know. I keep things to myself longer than I should. I know that too." "You've seen all of it," she said. "The whole year, all the parts that aren't the good version of me." "Yeah," he said. "That's why I'm asking." Something in her face changed. He watched the decision settle. Not a dramatic shift, just a quieting, the way a person looks when they've stopped arguing with themselves and arrived somewhere they recognize as right. She picked up the ring with careful hands and looked at it. The light caught the stone. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. He hadn't known how much he was holding until it moved. She laughed through the beginning of tears, that specific combination of relief and feeling too much at once. And he leaned over and she let him, and for a moment they were just 2 people at a coffee counter with the rest of the room indifferent around them, which was exactly where they'd started. Frank appeared at the far end of the counter, looked at them, looked at the ring, and went back to wiping down the espresso machine without comment. but Ethan caught the slight movement at the corner of his mouth. Yes, they were married in March. Small, the way both of them wanted. A room at the botanical garden near the west side of the city. 40 people. No production. His sister flew in from Portland. Mrs. Calloway cried from the second row. Several colleagues came, including Gerald Holt, who shook Ethan's hand before the ceremony with the grip of a man who had been right about something and was privately satisfied about it. Lily wore a blue dress she had selected herself after rejecting 7 others. She had been officially designated, at her own insistence, as Assistant Flower Girl and Future CEO, a title she had announced to at least 12 people by the time the ceremony began. She performed her role with the focused commitment of someone who understood that a good job done in a supporting capacity was still a good job. When the ceremony was over and the room had loosened into the informal part of the evening, Ethan found himself standing near the window with a glass of something he wasn't really drinking, watching the room. Victoria was across the space talking to his sister, and whatever they were saying was making his sister laugh. A real laugh. The kind she didn't deploy for politeness. He filed that away. It mattered. Lily appeared at his elbow. She had eaten a piece of cake before dinner, which he had noticed and chosen not to address, and there was still a small trace of frosting near her ear that she was unaware of. "Dad," she said. "Hey, this was good." "Yeah?" "Yeah." She leaned against him in the casual way she had, her shoulder against his arm. "I'm glad we found her." He looked at her. "We?" "Well," she considered this. "You found her, but I helped keep her." He looked across the room at Victoria, who chose that exact moment to look back at him with an expression that was private and direct in the way of something that belonged only between them. He held it for a second. "Yeah," he said. "You did." The company continued to grow in the years that followed through the usual combination of good decisions, corrected mistakes, and circumstances neither Victoria nor anyone else had fully predicted. The quarterly numbers that mattered stayed strong. New people came in, and old problems were replaced by new ones, as they always are. The work was ongoing because work is always ongoing. Ethan led his division with the same approach he'd brought on the first day. Specific, plain, honest about what he didn't know yet. He made mistakes and said so. He was promoted once more, 2 years in, and took the expanded scope with the same absence of performance that he brought to everything. Victoria kept running the company the way she always had. She still worked too much. She got slightly better about it in the years after Lily, after she became, not officially, but in the way that matters more than officially, the other parent in that apartment. And she remained not good about it entirely, which was accurate to who she was. She was not a person who arrived at wholeness and stayed there. She was a person who worked at it, daily, with varying results. There were hard stretches. A period in the second year of their marriage when the pressure at the company hit a particular pitch, and she pulled inward in the way she always did under sustained stress, and the distance lasted long enough to be a problem rather than a pattern, and they had a real argument about it. Not a clean argument, a messy one, with things said that needed to be walked back, and then actually walked back, which was the harder part. They got through it. Not because they were well-suited in some frictionless way, but because they had both decided, separately and together, that getting through it was what you did when something was real. Lily grew. That was the thing that happened most clearly and most continuously. She grew into herself, into the specific person she was becoming, in the way that children do when they have enough stability around them to risk finding out who they are. She was opinionated and perceptive and occasionally difficult, and she read everything she could get her hands on, and she asked questions of Victoria about the company with the specific interest of someone who was taking notes. Victoria answered them seriously, every time, because she had recognized early that Lily's questions were not casual. "She's going to run something someday," Victoria told Ethan once, when Lily was 10 and had spent 20 minutes at dinner laying out what she called an efficiency problem in the way her school organized the lunch schedule. "I know," he said. "It might be my company." "Would that bother you?" Victoria thought about that. "No," she said. "Actually, no. I think I'd be fine with that." There is a version of this story that wants to be a lesson, that wants to arrive at the end and say, this is what it means, this is what you take away, this is the moral. neat and extractable and packaged for easy carrying. The real version is messier than that and more honest. What it comes down to is this. Two people almost didn't find each other because the machinery of their lives was pointed in different directions. A man who had been making himself smaller for years to fit the space available to him. A woman who had built something large and impressive and found herself standing in the center of it, alone. They found each other by accident in an ordinary place on a day when neither of them was looking for anything more than coffee. And then they had to choose, repeatedly. Not once in a grand, dramatic moment, but in the small moments that come after. The choice to be honest when it was easier not to, the choice to stay when staying was uncomfortable, the choice to show up on a Sunday afternoon with groceries and admit, quietly and without ceremony, that you'd like to belong somewhere. That is the thing that gets missed in the cleaner versions of stories like this one. The choice is not singular. It is made again and again in the small, specific friction of two people's actual lives. And it never gets easier exactly. It just gets more familiar, and the familiarity becomes its own kind of trust. Ethan Walker was not a man who believed the world owed him anything. He had learned that early and thoroughly, and it was one of the better things he knew. He had learned that the work you do, the actual, specific, provable work, is the only argument that holds over time. That integrity is not a virtue you proclaim, it is a record you build, line by line, day by day, in decisions that often feel small when you make them. Victoria Hayes was not a woman who had waited to be rescued. She had built something real from nothing at considerable cost, and she knew the cost intimately. What she had not known, what she had maybe not let herself know, was that success and solitude were not the same as security, that the thing she was most capable of building was not a company, that the hardest construction project she would ever undertake would be learning, at 30, how to let someone in past the part where it was still safe. And Lily, who was not part of either of their plans, who was simply there, the specific, bright, difficult person she was, had a way of cutting through all of it, of asking the question that was actually worth asking, of knowing what mattered by the age of 7 in a way that some people never arrive at. The family they built was not the family anyone had mapped out. It did not arrive on schedule or in the expected shape. It was assembled from a chance encounter and a job interview and 6 weeks of investigation and a fall fair with badly organized games and Sunday lunches that ran long and a coffee counter on a quiet Saturday night in October. It was imperfect in every specific way. It was exactly enough.